In this video, we're going to learn how to fire a KMT, which is a Kiln Master touchscreen, and we're going to learn how to fire the regular button box that usually comes on the front display panel of most modern kilns nowadays. Hello, you dirty potters. How are you today? Today we are going to be talking about loading and firing your bisque kiln. There's a lot of information that I need to go over before we even start with actually physically putting your stuff into the kiln, because the firing process of how to load and fire your bisque kiln is actually really easy, but making sure that you're safe and making sure that your ware will survive inside of the kiln while it fires is even more important. So in this video, we're gonna go over a couple of those tips and tricks to make your firing experience a little bit easier and make sure that your work survives in the kiln. Before we get started with this video, there's two things I want to tell you. Number one, a lot of this video is going to be heavy information on how to physically load your kiln, some of the tips and tricks that I've learned over time about loading your kiln and how it would make it a little bit easier for you, and some of the things that you probably don't know if you clicked on this video, because you probably have never loaded a kiln before, or you're just looking for extra information. That's number one. Number two, there's a couple timestamps up here. These two timestamps are just going to be the button sequences for firing your kiln. Some people are either impatient or they just want to know how to fire their kiln in accordance with like what buttons to push based on what they have. So I've already made a video on how to fire a manual kiln, kilns that are usually a little bit older. I made it quite some time ago. I'll post it down below for you. That one's pretty easy for anyone who has a manual kiln. It's a little bit cringy because it's like one of my older videos before I learned like lighting and sound quality, but the information's still there and it'll still teach you how to fire a manual kiln. In this video, we're gonna learn how to fire a KMT, which is a Kiln Master touchscreen, and we're gonna learn how to fire the regular button box that usually comes on the front display panel of most modern kilns nowadays. If you just want to cut to that part of the video where you literally just want to see the buttons to push, then I will leave two timestamps up there. One of them is for the Kiln Master touchscreen, and the other one is for the display box that has the buttons on it. Those two are actually really easy to explain and take maybe about 2 minutes to show you on camera, but the rest of this video is going to be techniques on how to actually load a bisque kiln. Before we get started, there's some information that you're probably going to need if you are a true beginner at loading your kiln. Number one, you're gonna need some bone dry ware. Bone dry is a term that most potters use to describe how dry their pottery is. I'll make a scale for you right here, and this scale will describe the dry stages in which most pottery goes through when crafting or after crafting it. When you first make a pot or sculpt, it's in like the greenest of fresh phases. This is usually wet pottery, wet ceramic artwork. It's usually really tacky and it's super malleable. In fact, if you touch it even more so than you're supposed to, sometimes it'll morph. Most of us know this stage. It's considered to be during the throwing stage most of the time, or when you take the pot directly off of the wheel and put it somewhere to dry. After this, it dries a little bit more and starts going through the leather phases. At its softest point, it'll be malleable, but no longer tacky and sticky. This is called the leather soft phase. This is the phase in which you can kind of morph and sculpt and form the stuff. It's not tacky anymore, but it's still very malleable and movable. If you touch it a little bit too much or bump into it, it will mess up from its symmetry if that's not what you're looking for. After it dries from the leather soft phase, it'll go to the leather phase. The leather phase is where most of us do a lot of our trimming and a lot of our attaching of other clays. Let's say you're making a mug. Well, this is the stage that we usually attach that handle to the mug itself after trimming it, if you do choose to trim it. As it continues to dry, it goes to the leather hard phase. The leather hard phase is like you're not attaching any more stuff, you're probably not trimming it anymore unless you're trimming it really late, which is going to mess up your tools after a while. And the time in which you can attach clay safely without it cracking too much or trying to really dry them at the same time when you're attaching stuff is kind of over. But this is the perfect stage that I usually use for carving, things of that nature. Going past that is the bone dry phase. The bone dry phase is where as much water has evaporated or left the clay body as is possible for your current atmosphere. This is the phase where it's ready to be put inside of your kiln so that it can go through the bisque and a little bit of quartz inversion, something that we'll talk about later. But for those of you who are looking for that fancy word, after all of your work is bone dry, that's when it's ready to go inside of your bisque load. You don't want to put your stuff in the bisque before the bone dry phase. If there's water left in the clay body and you put it inside your kiln, the water will usually expand as heat rises in the kiln, which, for lack of better term, causes little explosions. And sometimes it rises a little bit too fast and will end up destroying a lot of your work. Potters have tons of stories about how they put their stuff in their kiln trying to speed up the process at the leather soft or even the leather hard phase, only to explode in the kiln because the water molecules inside of your clay body just expanded way too fast. So as a safe bet to make sure all your work survives, you might want to make sure that it's completely dry and in the bone dry phase. It's heavily suggested. All of the drying stages, in which I just named on the scale right here, are all considered the greenware phase. Your stuff is greenware until it goes into the bisque. Once it comes out of the bisque, it is then bisqueware. There is technically a little bit more explanation scientifically and stuff that goes on in between the greenware phase and the bisque phase in the kiln, but seeing as this is just a how to load your bisque kind of kiln video, I don't want to talk about those just yet. We'll talk about them in another video. Making sure that the water is outside of all of your work so that it's in the bone dry phase is a little bit difficult, specifically if you've never done it before. As an experienced potter, I can kind of tell by just looking at something or touching something, but as a general rule, you want to let it dry for a fairly long time. About a week is what I let my stuff do for air dry, just to make sure that it's completely out. I can show you a couple pictures as an example of something that is leather hard versus bone dry. For example, this picture here. These are both the same exact clay body and they've been drying at different times. See how one of them is a little bit darker than the other one? That's because one of them has a little bit more water in it and in fact is in the leather hard phase while the other one is bone dry. They also make a different sound when you tap them. Keep in mind these are pretty much the same exact cup and they're also different dry times. While one of them still has water in the clay body, the other one doesn't. They sound, feel, because one of them is cold to the touch while the other one is not. The one that's not is the more dry one. And they look a little bit different even though they're the same clay body. Keep in mind there's many different ways to tell if something is all the way bone dry or if it's still in the leather phases. But you really want to make sure your stuff is in the bone dry phase. After you've made sure all your stuff is the bone dry phase, it's time to start loading it into the kiln so that we can start bisquing your stuff. Make sure your kiln is off at this point. I usually just make sure my kiln's off because number one, I don't want any mishaps, and number two, it just saves energy to have your kiln off when you're not using it. I usually go to the back, turn on the breaker, the kiln turns on, power goes to it, and then I use it. When I'm done using it, I turn it back off. I'm a big advocate of saving power, and because of that, I don't like just having something on all the time when I'm not using it. So you might want to make sure it's off and completely not running while you're doing this. When you buy your first kiln, it'll either come with or be heavily suggested that you buy kiln furniture. Most kiln furniture comes in the form of kiln stilts and kiln shelves. Kiln shelves both come in whole and halves. I personally like to use halves, but that's just me. But there are some that fill out like over here and will come in entirely whole pieces. I just personally like halves. This kiln furniture is meant to be used as if you were building a little tower inside of your kiln. You're going to build them like this. You will then be putting pottery on one level, so that way it'll go right underneath it. They can touch, by the way, because it's just bisque. After you're done filling that level, you're gonna put one shelf up here like this. And then you're going to continue that process going up and up, putting the next level of greenware on the next shelf and on the next shelf until you have completely filled your kiln. This is the way that kiln furniture, stilts and shelves included, were meant to be used. You're essentially going to be doing it on the inside of the kiln, so that way all of your work is on the inside and stacked all the way from the bottom up. A little potter tip here, if you have a full shelf, it's super easy to set the shelf down while putting 4 stilts, just like this. And when you build the next level, you're gonna put the stilts in the exact same place. Don't offset the stilts, so don't build a level like this and then build another level of stilts like this. Just keep them stacked on top of each other for stability. But if you have half shelves, it's a little bit of a different story. If you have half shelves like I do, you're essentially gonna have to share 2 of those stilts with the other half shelf. So you're gonna put one shelf down, just like this, and you're gonna keep a little bit of space on this shelf right here. So this way, when you put the other shelf down, you put it right here, and you're gonna be sharing those 2 middle spots. After this, it'll sit like a full shelf, just like that. Because you now know the stage that your pottery has to be in as far as dryness goes, and I showed you how to build levels with the kiln shelves and the kiln stilts, or the kiln furniture as you will, you now officially know how to load a bisque kiln. Just put your stuff in the kiln in that manner that I showed you, and it's really easy. But here's a bunch of tips that you probably either don't know because you're new, or some stuff that'll help you load your kiln in the future. I'm also going to be providing you with videos as well as examples up here for these tips. It'd be weird if I just told you. I feel like this is a very physical art form and I should probably show you at some point. Tip number 1, your greenware going into the bisque can touch each other. This means that not only do you not have to worry about space that much, you can probably load double the amount of greenware going into your bisque for your glaze load later on. This means for every bisque load that you have, if you're really good at it, you can technically get 3 glaze loads out of it depending on the stuff inside. This also comes in handy for nesting or stacking. I nest and stack my bowls all the time. I make like 50 or 40 bowls per load, but all those bowls fit on one level because I can do this with them. I can literally just fit bowls inside of bowls because they won't stick together because there's not a lot of glass-like material or enough silica or enough metals or irons in the clay body to stick together and melt to each other. So because stuff can touch in the bisque, you can pull off stuff like this all the time. Tip number 2, because you can put anything in the kiln as long as it doesn't go over the kiln furniture or the stilts that I showed you earlier, you could technically put stuff in there a little bit wonky. See this bowl right here? It wouldn't fit flat on its foot, so I just put it in between a bowl and a cup and it totally fits now. But keep in mind, when it's edged like this, it's a little bit higher, right? So as long as it doesn't go over the kiln shelf, we're good. Tip number 3, and it does take a little bit of practice, but when you saw me putting the kiln shelves down earlier, you probably noticed that my hands were a little bit askew. That's because it's super comfortable to hold the shelves at the very edges of them like this. Like if the shelf is like this, it's comfortable to hold it at these sides. But when you put it down, your hands, which are gripping underneath the shelf, are probably gonna get in the way of the kiln stilts, right? It takes a bit of practice, but make sure that your hands are a little bit askew, otherwise you're just gonna crush your fingers in between the shelves. I do it all the time actually, even when I have half shelves, to the point where I've developed just enough forearm strength to put down shelves with one arm, because I know for sure that the kiln stilts aren't gonna be in that space. So I just put it down like that. But for like 7 months, I ended up grabbing the shelves by the 2 half ends and crushing my hands on the stilts because I was like, well, this is the most easy way I have to put them in. And keep in mind, you do have to bend over when you put them in the kiln. So you're probably naturally looking for more stability. It's totally cool to make this mistake a couple of times, but just as a pre-warning, it's just easier to skew your hands a little bit. Tip number 4, and this is more of a plea. Please don't pick the largest stilt first and just be like, well, clearly it's the largest stilt. It's gonna clear all my cups because clearly this stilt is bigger than the other ones. Don't do that. You're gonna waste space. Here's a little video here, right? What I did is I got the biggest cup that I knew would go on that level, and as long as all the other cups are smaller than that cup, whatever stilt I pick that is just above that one cup is fine for the rest of the cups. And that's how I enter each and every level. But do not make the mistake of just picking the largest kiln stilt and being like, well, it's bigger than this cup. Like, test them out. See which one gives you the most space, because if you keep doing this, you're just wasting space, time, and electricity. Tip number 5, which is probably the biggest tip, is the biggest, it's not, it's a pun, you'll see, it's funny, you'll see. Put your larger stuff at the top of your kiln load. There's gonna be so many times where, I'm just gonna show you actually. There's gonna be so many times that you wanna put something that's like this in your kiln, but you can't exactly put this at the bottom because my biggest kiln stilt is like this big, so it's almost impossible. Not only is it almost impossible, if you have a little bit of space left at the top of your kiln, this will fit right in without another shelf going above it. You don't have to stack, and if you have half shelves like I do, you can just work around it. You can put one shelf here and the other half can be full of other stuff up here like cups and bowls. That's one of the reasons I choose to use half shelves. But for bigger stuff specifically, just put them at the top of your kiln. Not only is it just better for your space, it's also far more stable because even if you could find a kiln stilt that was 1.5 feet tall, like this, like sideways vases right here, you would pretty much have to have the instability all the way down at the bottom. So as a general rule, we put the stuff at the top of our kiln that's super big like this. If you're really having a hard time and you have stuff that's that kind of shape like I just showed you right now, you can technically lay it down. So for example, the top level of my shelf is right here, but that vase was like this big, right? It almost didn't fit the camera screen. I could just lay that down. It's not too hard. I don't have to stand everything up like I said in the previous tip earlier. So you can do that with big stuff as well, as long as you put something in between to make sure it stops from rolling because most of our stuff is round. You can even use other pieces if you want. So let's say you wanted to put that big round base on its side, but you don't want it to roll while it's firing just in case it hits anything else. Just put a piece by its side over here, put a piece by its side over here, and put the big piece in the middle, and it doesn't roll. I like to use kiln stilts, but don't tell nobody. That's a secret. That's my secret. As a final step, before I show you how to program the touchscreen kiln, because I know someone's gonna mention it down in the comments below, there are potters who are experienced enough who can technically tumble stack their stuff. Tumble stacking is where you don't use shelves like I just showed you. This is the very standard way. Tumble stacking is where people use certain pressure points and load certain things in certain spots so that they don't crack underneath the heat and the pressure of each other in order to get the maximum space out of their kiln. It's really good for heat distribution. The issue is that if you're watching this video and you're learning how to load a bisque kiln, you're probably not to that level yet. But I know there's gonna be some nerd in the comments below who's like, you don't have to do this way, guys. There's a thing called tumble stacking. I just wouldn't feel very comfortable showing you that when you're learning how to load a bisque kiln. But tumble stacking essentially equates to throwing all your stuff in there, but knowing all the pressure points so that you get the maximum amount of stuff in the bisque kiln. You can get like 3 or 4 different glaze loads out of that bisque kiln. It's really good for conservation of energy, and it's really good for distribution of heat. The issue is that it's definitely not a beginner thing. Could you imagine if I just turned on the camera and I was like, yeah, guys, just throw your crap in there. Don't even use shit, just throw all your crap in there. It'd be great. Everything will survive. And when I go over how to load a glaze load, you're gonna have to know how to do this shelf technique anyway. And this is kind of the standard for a bisque anyway as well. So it's not like I'm teaching you this just because I think it's the better way. I'm teaching you this way because you're gonna have to learn this anyway in order to load your glaze kiln. The final tip that I can give you that has nothing to do with actually loading your bisque is that electricity costs different rates for different people at different times of the day. For example, in California, they charge me way more for electricity in between the hours of like 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. So if I want to fire my kiln load, I usually fire it after 8 p.m. while everyone in the house is sleeping. It saves me money, it saves energy, and they charge me way less money for electricity because those are the non-active hours in my general area. So if you want to save yourself a little bit of money or you're a little more concerned about that, I heavily suggest checking out the prices and seeing when like the low cost times are for your electricity so that you can fire it during those times. Okay, with all that being said, I am now going to show you what buttons to push on the Kiln Master touchscreen in order to fire it. Hopefully you went through all that not knowing that stuff, but if you did, I did leave a timestamp for you so you can't complain now. So this right here is the KMT. KMT stands for Kiln Master Touchscreen. There are such models without a touchscreen, and we'll be talking about those later. But for now, this is the touchscreen model of the Kiln Master from Scott. Now, this is pretty simple to load your bisque. It's extremely easy because it's a guided system. You can just push begin here. For now, you can just go to programs, and you can go to guided start if you're just doing a bisque load and this is your first time loading a bisque. You can worry about these two later if you ever need something a little bit more fancy, but for now we're going to click guided start. It's going to ask you if you're firing ceramics or glass. We are firing ceramics, so we're going to click next. It'll ask you if it's bisque, glaze, or preheat. We're going to be doing bisque. Preheat is a whole different thing. I usually say yes because in my old manual kiln I used to do something called candling. Candling is where you slowly heat it up until you're sure that all the water is out, and I like to do this just because I like to be a little bit more safe than sorry. So I usually put other time. It'll ask you what other time after you push next, and I usually go for about 2 hours. Most people can probably figure this out, but the hours go on the left hand side and the minutes go on the right, and they display that right about here for you. So I'm going to put it for 2 hours by pushing 2, 0, 0, filling in the minute side with just zeros, and then pushing next. Once I push next, it'll ask me if I want cone 04, 05, or other. Most people bisque their stuff in between cone 04 and cone 06. The regulation is usually 04, so I'm going to go with 04. I'm going to push next, and it'll ask you whether you want to do it slow or medium. At this point, you have to decide whether you want to heat up your stuff slower or medium. Medium is if everything's kind of thinner or on the same size scale. Nothing really in there is too thick or too big, because if you heat your stuff up way too fast, it sometimes expands a little too fast in the kiln, and then it'll ruin that specific piece. Because I have a vase in there that's about 1.5 feet tall, I'm going to go with slow, as I usually do, just because I'm more safe than sorry. And that's pretty much it for the touchscreen for loading your very first bisque. The Kiln Master touchscreen models are extremely easy to use. They in fact have their own guided system. After this, you push next, You can view program, you can change the time here, you can do essentially anything you like, but after you've gone through that guided start process, assuming everything is correct and to your specifications, it'll tell you the estimated time right here. It'll tell you the alarm, which almost never, well, I've never seen it get to this temperature here. You can also change the speed if you want right here, the cone. You can change almost everything, including the preheat, on this little panel right here. It's kind of a review panel. And then you can push start if you want it to start. It's gonna go through its check all system, and then it's going to start firing as you hear it click off. Now, if you don't want this or you're unsure, you wanna go over the specifications again, you can always push details and it'll show you that panel again. And if you wanna stop the entire process altogether because you either have to go somewhere, you're unsure about the firing process, or you wanna load some more stuff and you have a little bit more time to do it, you can always just push stop, and it will stop the entire process and go back to idle. But this is pretty much it for the touchscreen, although it does have a fantastic guided system, so it's pretty easy to fire these things off after you've learned to actually load your bisque. Now the button box system is a little bit different, but it's still pretty easy to manage, so we're gonna talk about that one next. Lindsay!
Donte!
Hi, are you loading your bisque kiln right now?
I'm loading my bisque kiln right now.
Can you please show the viewers at home how to load this specific type of control panel on your kiln? Because I feel like most of them have this type.
Yes. Okay, so the first thing that I'll do is I'll hit stop. This is basically like hitting clear on a calculator. So next thing I'm gonna do is I'll hit cone fire. It's gonna ask me how long I wanna preheat the kiln. Sometimes for a bisque, I'll do 1 to 2 hours. So I'll hit 1, 0, 0, enter. Now it's gonna ask what cone I want it fired to. It's gonna show the last cone that you fired this at, but let's say it had been a glaze firing. So I would hit cone 0, 5 and hit enter again. Now it's gonna ask what speed I want. For the most part, for a bisque firing, I will do slow or medium. So let's just hit slow, hit enter again. Now it's gonna ask for how long I wanna hold. So this is once the kiln reaches its peak temperature, how long do I wanna hold it at that temperature? I tend to not do a hold, but if you wanted to, this is how you do it. Let's say you wanna do a 5-minute hold. So 0 hours and 5 minutes, enter again. That's pretty much it. But since humans are fallible, you wanna make sure that you input everything correctly. So you'll go down to this button here and hit review. So cone 05, which is Fahrenheit 1888, speed is slow, hold is 5 minutes, preheating is for 1 hour, delay, there's no delay, alarm, I don't have this set up, ERCD, can't remember what that is, cost, don't have that set up either, fire is 206. So for those things that I didn't clarify what they are, I know it's in the manual, I'm just too lazy to look it up, but anyway, that's basically how you do it. And then also you hit start.
Of course, it's of course.
And if you messed up and you're like, oh no, I didn't mean to hit start, cool, you just hit stop.
And you can hear the relays once you push start, kicking on and off usually with this type of kiln.
Yeah.
Oh hey, we are now back at the house and my kiln is done firing. You probably didn't know this because I was using it for example, but I actually fired my kiln earlier for realsies. There's a couple of things that you're probably gonna ask once your kiln is done firing its bisque. Number one, what's up with these peepholes? Should I leave any of them out? Does that count as venting? What is venting? What do I do with those? These are called peepholes. They're usually meant to look at the cone watchers that you would usually place right here in front of the hole so that you could look at it and see how the fire is going. I generally don't use them that way, but that's mostly how they're supposed to be used. The secondary use for them is to make sure that some airflow gets in and out of the kiln, especially when you're firing or after you're firing your kiln load. Like for example, whenever I fire my bisque load, I actually leave this top one right here just completely out. I take it out altogether. That's because I know that heat rises and any of the impurities from the clay bodies are probably gonna come up and out of that hole. It doesn't help that much, but I always had kind of an inkling of this. Later on, I read the manual and they were like, yeah, you should do that. That's actually a good thing to do. I usually do something called venting my kiln. I usually start venting my kiln around 250 or 300 degrees, and that's considered relatively safe for a lot of other experienced potters. I've even heard of some potters venting their kiln around 400 or 500 degrees, slowly cracking it open to let cold air in and hot air out, which is basically venting around that temperature. And I'm always afraid of something called thermoshock. Thermoshock is essentially when you let cold air in and hot air out and they kind of meet in the middle on one body. You ever wash a candle glass or like a wine glass that was really hot or had fire inside of it at some point, and you wash it underneath cold water and it gets thermoshock and ends up just exploding, you know, that can technically happen with your pottery. Granted, it's really rare, but it's one of the reasons why I don't pull one of these whenever it's like 500 degrees. So what most of us do is we open the kiln little by little when it's done firing. Somewhere around 400 degrees is my personal take on it. A lot of other people have different takes on it for their temperatures, and I'll slowly do this. And as it gets a little cooler, I'll start opening and opening. In fact, this is so regular for potters that the type of kiln that I have came with this little stilt right here built into the side. So this is kind of the locked level right here where you don't want anyone to open it. Especially for children, it's really difficult for them to open this just straight up. This level right here is if I want to start venting my kiln. This lets a little bit of hot air out and a little bit of cold air in. This level here is pretty much full vent. You want the kiln to cool down, you're ready for it to go. This usually happens for me somewhere around 200 to 250 degrees. I don't have special kiln gloves to take stuff out. I heavily recommend that you get some heat resistant gloves, but I take them out barehanded after washing my hands. This is just the level at which I go, okay, I want it to speed up a little bit more, but I usually do this around 200 to 250 degrees. This is something that I'm pretty sure they didn't intend for me to do, but I do it anyway. This is when I'm really in a rush. Granted, it's heavily suggested that you just leave your kiln alone until it's done firing and it equals kind of the outside temperature of whatever's going on around you. I understand that it's gonna be a lot colder than 100 degrees in a colder place than it would be in a hotter place. So whatever your normal temperature is, let it get somewhere near that to really open it. It's heavily suggested that you just leave it alone until it's done with its process. But I know for sure that some of you are going to ignore that. And when the kiln is completely done firing, you have nice, ready to go bisqueware. There's a massive difference now, you'll probably notice, in between this, which is greenware, and this, which is fully ready to be glazed bisqueware. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. I just thought I would make a video on how to actually load and fire your bisque, along with a couple of other tips and tricks on how to fire your bisque. Firing your bisque load, as far as the actual sequence of buttons, isn't that difficult. It's like a 5 or 6 button press along with reviewing your steps. And I have a touch screen, so it's easy, but we did show you how to do the kind of manual box that Lindsay has. But I have also made a manual kiln video with the kiln sitters and everything, so we've covered all the bisque videos from this point on. Keep in mind that I put the other video, the manual kiln for the older kilns, down below for you. But thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, click all the YouTube buttons so my YouTube overlords are happy with me. Hopefully you guys have a good bisque load if you're watching this video specifically because you're starting to learn to load your own bisque and be your own kiln master. I hope you have great luck with that. I love your Dirty Potter faces, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week.
Thank you for your patronage.
It's almost like I thought about what I was going to teach you before I taught it to you, and I'm teaching it to you in a progressionary fashion.